She misses you, but will never admit it. There comes a moment in every connection when the energy begins to shift. Not because a major argument takes place or someone officially leaves, but because absence slowly starts speaking louder than presence ever did. This idea suggests that when a woman starts missing a man but refuses to admit it, her behavior begins revealing a story that her words are trying to hide. Many men assume that when a woman misses them, she will immediately reach out and send a clear message or admit it openly. But emotional reality rarely works in such a direct way. Pride becomes involved, ego becomes involved, and fear becomes involved. And sometimes the stronger the feeling becomes, the harder it is for her to express it. A woman can deeply miss someone while appearing completely unaffected on the outside, thinking about him throughout the day while pretending he never crossed her mind, and checking her phone hoping for his name while convincing herself that she does not care. This contradiction is something many men fail to understand, because when a woman begins missing someone, she often enters a silent internal conflict where one part of her wants to reach out. Another part wants to stay in control, one part wants attention, and another part wants proof that she still matters without having to ask for it. This is why her behavior can start to look confusing, as she may suddenly become more active on social media and post things she normally would not post. Not because she wants the whole world to see them, but because there is one specific person she hopes notices, and that person is him. In this state, she wants to know if he is watching. She wants to know if he is paying attention, and she wants to know if his silence means he has truly moved on. The interesting part is that missing someone creates curiosity, because when a woman stops hearing from a man she once had easy access to, she begins questioning things she never thought about before, such as what he is doing, who he is talking to, whether he is happy, or if he has forgotten her. Each unanswered question slowly increases emotional investment, because people tend to value what becomes uncertain or no longer predictable. When he was always available, she clearly understood where she stood and there was no mystery or challenge. But once his presence is removed, she is left alone with her thoughts, and thoughts have a strong way of amplifying emotions. The experience of missing someone rarely appears all at once, because it arrives in small emotional moments, such as hearing a song that reminds her of him, passing a place connected to a memory, remembering a joke from the past, or suddenly recalling conversations that happened months ago without warning. In those moments, she may remember how safe she once felt, and she may begin to miss things she previously took for granted, which is where reality starts teaching lessons that pride alone could never teach. Appreciation often grows in absence because when someone is constantly present, their value can become invisible not because it is not there, but because humans naturally get used to what they have. However, once that presence, attention, and communication are removed, the mind begins comparing the current reality with the past, and that comparison creates longing and emotional pull. One of the clearest signs that a woman misses someone but refuses to admit it is when she creates indirect reasons to reconnect, as she will not openly say she misses him, but instead she may react to his posts, ask random questions, bring up something unimportant, or start conversations that seem unrelated, even though the real intention is connection rather than topic. People rarely reach out without emotional motivation. And when someone misses another person, interaction becomes the closest substitute for real presence. Another common sign is emotional inconsistency, where one day she appears distant and detached, but the next day she suddenly shows interest or reappears unexpectedly, which often confuses men who think she is playing games, when in reality she may be struggling with internal conflict. One part of her may be trying to move on while another part keeps looking back. One part tells her to stay away while another part still wants to know if he is there. And when these emotional sides collide, mixed signals naturally appear. What many men fail to realize is that missing someone creates vulnerability, and vulnerability feels uncomfortable, especially for people who prefer to appear strong and unaffected. Because admitting she misses someone means admitting they still matter and that their absence has an impact on her emotional state. This is why many women hide these feelings, not because they do not exist, but because exposing them feels risky, since there is always the fear of being ignored, rejected, or discovering that the other person has already moved on. And fear often keeps people silent, more than a lack of emotion ever does. This is also where many men make mistakes, because the moment they sense that a woman misses them, they often rush to fill the silence by chasing, over-messaging, or seeking constant validation. But attraction tends to respond more strongly to emotional stability than desperation. When a woman misses someone, the worst response is panic or over-pursuit. And instead, the stronger approach is to remain grounded, focused, and busy building one's own life. Because real value becomes most visible when it stands independently without chasing attention. A man who stays confident, productive, and emotionally stable becomes difficult to forget. Not because he is trying to be unforgettable, but because his consistent energy naturally leaves a lasting impression that continues to stay in her mind. The truth is that missing someone is not only about missing their physical presence, but also about missing the way they made you feel. People tend to remember emotions much longer than they remember specific details, so she may forget exact conversations, dates, or small events, but she will still remember how she felt around you. She remembers whether she felt understood, whether she felt respected, and whether she felt truly seen. And when those feelings become rare, your absence becomes much more noticeable. Sometimes a woman even convinces herself that she does not miss you, as she stays busy, distracts herself with work, spends time with friends, and does everything possible to avoid facing her emotions. But emotions that are ignored are not emotions that disappear. Eventually, they return, usually in quiet moments, usually when distractions fade, and that is when the truth becomes harder to avoid. Because she realizes she misses you not because you were perfect, but because you held a meaningful place in her life, and meaningful places are not easily replaced. Many men believe attraction is created through constant pursuit, but some of the deepest emotional realizations actually happen during absence. Because when someone no longer has unlimited access to you, they are forced to see your value more clearly, without pressure, persuasion, or influence. Only reality. And reality tends to speak louder than words. When a woman begins checking whether you have viewed her stories, wondering who you are spending time with, paying closer attention to your life, or finding small excuses to stay connected, something deeper is usually happening beneath the surface, even if she never says it directly or admits it openly, because she may still act strong and pretend everything is fine while her emotions are revealed through behavior long before they are revealed through words. The strongest position a man can take is not chasing outcomes, but allowing her feelings to be her responsibility, giving her space to process her emotions and discover his value on her own. Because when realization comes naturally, it carries far more weight than when it is forced. And the goal is not to make someone miss you, but to become the kind of man whose presence naturally matters. A man with purpose, standards, and self-respect, who continues moving forward whether someone stays or leaves, becomes unforgettable. Not because he tries to be, but because his consistent energy leaves a lasting impact, and confidence naturally creates memories while strength creates emotional weight that is not easily erased. So if a woman starts missing you but refuses to admit it, There is no need to obsess over signs or overanalyze every message, reaction, or social media activity, because the focus should remain on becoming stronger, wiser, and more valuable than before. Since while she may be struggling with her emotions internally, the most powerful thing a man can do is continue becoming someone she cannot easily forget. The reason this matters is because human nature does not always appreciate certainty, but it deeply responds to realization. And when someone always knows they can have your attention whenever they want, they often stop recognizing its value, not out of malice, but because familiarity slowly turns even meaningful things into something ordinary. Then, when that attention disappears, when messages stop, calls stop, and effort stops, silence begins to raise questions that words never asked. And she starts remembering things she once overlooked, like the way you listened, the small details you remembered, the way you made her laugh on difficult days, and the way your presence made life feel lighter, even if those moments seemed small at the time, because memories grow stronger when they are no longer being replaced by new experiences. That is why missing someone is often less about dramatic moments and more about ordinary daily experiences, the routine presence that people assume will always remain. A woman who misses you but refuses to admit it often becomes more observant, noticing your growth, your confidence, and your absence from places where you once were. And sometimes even noticing when others start paying attention to you, which can create emotions she was not prepared for, because there is a clear difference between choosing distance and realizing that distance has consequences. Many people believe they are ready for someone's absence until they actually face it, thinking moving on will be easy, forgetting will be natural, or replacing someone will fix everything. But reality often shows that meaningful connections are not interchangeable, that chemistry cannot be forced, and that finding someone who truly understood you is not simple. And this realization usually arrives long after the connection has already changed. There are moments when she may smile at an old memory and quickly suppress it. Moments when she sees something that reminds her of you and wants to share it. And moments when she picks up her phone to message you but puts it down again, not because she does not care, but because she cares more than she wants to admit. Since emotions are rarely logical and do not always follow reason, and if they did, people would not miss those who hurt them or replay conversations from years ago. Sometimes she misses you because of the connection you shared. Sometimes because of the future she once imagined. Sometimes because of how things felt before life became complicated. And sometimes simply because no one else has replaced what you brought into her life. Which is why patience becomes powerful, even though most men struggle with impatience. They want immediate answers, immediate validation, and immediate certainty. But attraction and emotional realization rarely move that fast. Because people need time to process what they feel. Time to understand what they have lost, time to compare experiences, and time to gain perspective. And perspective can change everything. Something that felt ordinary yesterday can feel deeply valuable tomorrow. And something that seemed replaceable yesterday can suddenly feel irreplaceable, which is the real power of perspective. When a woman starts missing someone, she often becomes more aware of his strengths than when he was constantly present, and qualities she once overlooked begin to stand out clearly, such as loyalty, consistency, effort, patience, and reliability, and the things she assumed would always be there suddenly become things she wishes she still had, which creates an internal conflict because admitting she misses him would also mean admitting she misjudged his value. And for many people, that is not easy. Pride resists admitting mistakes, and ego resists admitting miscalculations. So instead of openly expressing what she feels, she may look for subtle ways to stay connected, such as asking mutual friends about him, paying attention to updates in his life, or becoming curious about his progress, because distance often leads to observation, and observation often leads to appreciation. One of the strongest signs that a woman misses someone is not what she says, but the attention she invests in his life. Because attention is one of the most valuable currencies in human behavior, since people naturally focus on what occupies their mind. And when someone keeps directing attention toward you, it usually comes from something deeper than simple curiosity. Another important truth many men misunderstand is that missing someone does not automatically mean they will return, because a woman can miss someone and still stay silent. Think about him and still not reach out, and care deeply while still choosing distance, since emotions and decisions do not always align. And sometimes people avoid reconnecting because of fear of rejection, fear of complications, or uncertainty about how to rebuild what was lost. That is why emotional maturity matters, because you cannot control another person's choices or force their feelings. And what you can do instead is become someone whose value remains clear regardless of the outcome. A man who focuses on building himself during silence becomes stronger than a man who spends that time chasing answers, because while one obsesses over what she is thinking, the other focuses on improving his own life. And while one waits for validation, the other creates purpose. And while one becomes lost in uncertainty, the other becomes more certain of who he is. And that certainty is attractive. Not certainty about her, but certainty about himself. The strongest men are not those who never experience loss, but those who continue growing despite it, who refuse to let emotional setbacks define them, and who turn pain into progress because growth creates contrast, and contrast is something that cannot be ignored. Imagine a woman remembering a version of a man who was insecure, uncertain, and seeking approval, and then later seeing him again as someone who is confident, disciplined, focused, and thriving. Because that difference becomes impossible to overlook, and curiosity begins to form. Curiosity turns into interest. Interest turns into attention. And attention slowly becomes emotional investment. Not because he tried to impress her, but because he invested in himself. That is the part many people miss, because the most attractive response after losing someone is not convincing them of your value, but actually developing it. Since one approach seeks approval while the other produces results, and results always speak louder. When a woman starts missing someone, she often begins to revisit memories from a different emotional perspective, where moments that once felt casual start to feel meaningful. Conversations that seemed small begin to feel significant, and experiences that once felt normal begin to feel special. Because memory is shaped by emotion, and stronger emotion creates stronger memory, and absence often intensifies that emotional effect. At some point, she may even realize she is comparing other people to him, not consciously but naturally, because someone says something and she remembers how he would have responded. Someone behaves differently and she recalls how he stood out, and someone disappoints her and she remembers the consistency he once provided, because comparison is what reveals value. And people only fully understand certain qualities after experiencing their absence. This does not mean she is constantly thinking about him, but it does mean that his presence left a lasting impression. One strong enough to survive distance, time, and silence. And silence is important because it removes distractions and forces reflection, where people are left alone with their thoughts and begin asking themselves difficult questions about who made their life better, who showed up consistently, and who brought peace instead of confusion. And those answers often bring emotional clarity that can feel uncomfortable when it arrives late. That is also why some women never openly admit they miss someone. Not because they do not feel it, but because admitting it would require facing vulnerability, regret, longing, and uncertainty all at once, which can feel overwhelming. So those emotions remain hidden, even though hidden emotions still influence behavior and still appear in subtle patterns. The reality is that people can hide words more easily than they can hide behavior, because actions reveal emotions even when words do not. So when someone repeatedly finds reasons to reconnect, stays curious about your life, or reacts emotionally to your presence, those patterns often reveal more than any direct statement ever could. Meanwhile, your responsibility remains the same, which is to keep building, keep improving, and keep evolving, not to make someone miss you, but because your future deserves that effort, regardless of who notices. The strongest position a man can hold is one where his happiness is not dependent on someone else's realization, because the moment your self-worth depends on whether someone chooses you or misses you, you give away control you should never surrender. And when you take that control back, something changes. As you stop chasing validation, stop seeking constant recognition, and stop measuring your value through someone else's attention, and instead begin measuring your life through your own growth, discipline, and purpose. That shift often changes how others perceive you as well, because people begin to notice what they once overlooked. They start questioning assumptions, and they start revisiting memories with new perspective. And in those quiet moments between pride and emotion, a woman who refuses to admit she misses you may find herself thinking about you more than she expected. The most important part of all this is that missing someone often teaches lessons that presence never could. Because when someone is always available, their value can become invisible through familiarity. But when they are gone, the mind begins replaying moments that once seemed small, like encouragement during hard times, calmness during chaos, or simple gestures of care that only gain meaning in hindsight. And in those quiet moments, when distractions fade and honesty becomes unavoidable, people often admit to themselves what they would never say out loud. That absence feels heavier than expected. That moving on is not as simple as it seemed, and that some connections leave deeper marks than others. But regardless of whether she admits it or not, your path remains the same, which is to keep becoming stronger, wiser, and more disciplined. Because the biggest mistake a man can make is pausing his life while waiting for someone else to recognize his worth. Your value does not begin when she notices you, and it does not increase when she returns, because it already exists. The only difference is that she finally becomes aware of it. And by the time that realization arrives, you are no longer the same person she once knew, because growth has already changed you, confidence has already shaped you, and self-respect has already become your foundation. And that is why when a woman starts missing you but refuses to admit it, the most powerful response is not chasing her attention, but continuing to become a man whose absence carries more weight than his words ever could.